Welcome to another new module. Over the previous modules, you learned a lot about creating components and using the various React and actually native JavaScript features to display dynamic content, output dynamic content in JSX code, and much more. We also briefly touched on styling React components. I did it with inline styles and I showed you how to import a CSS file to apply these CSS styles. I also mentioned that these weren't scoped to the component you imported it in though. In this module, I want to focus on styling React components because there's more to it than what you saw thus far. For one, I want to have a look at how you can dynamically adjust styles or class names. And I also want to show you how to work around this restriction of either using inline styles and hence having scoped styles, but having limitations like not being able to use media queries or pseudo selectors, or using CSS files and then having global styles. There are a couple of ways of handling this, and we'll dive into all of these ways of working with styles in this module. I'm back in the project we worked on thus far. We got some basic styling in there, for example these cards where we output the persons and this button. But let's start with that button for example. We already have one issue. When we hover over it, it doesn't change its style. The problem is that this button, which is part of our app component, we can see it up here in our template, there. That this button simply is styled with inline styles. We assign them here and we set them up earlier in the render method here. We use JavaScript to create an object and assign that to the style property, and JSX and React takes care about setting this on the actual HTML element. The issue is we can't use pseudo selectors here. The advantage of course is the styling is only applied to this button and to no other button in the application if we had another button. And I already mentioned the alternative would be to style it in the CSS file, and there we can use normal CSS including pseudo selectors like hover, but this would then globally affect all buttons in our application even if they were placed in other components. This is the problem set I want to deal with in this module. But besides that, I also want to have a look at something else. What if we actually wanted to change styling dynamically? Let's start with that. Let's say toggle persons. This button should have a green background color if we are about to show persons with a click, and a red background color if we are about to remove the person list. Let's see how we can dynamically change styles in the next lecture. So with the problem set outlined in the last lecture, let's dynamically adjust the button style depending on whether we're about to show persons or not. Now, we already had a look at how we can dynamically render content, like here with the if statement where we store some JSX in a variable and then output that variable in our template or in our return function here, I should say. Now, as always, everything here is JavaScript. So if we assign a style to the button here, this part between the curly braces can be any JavaScript expression. For one, we could of course pass a JavaScript object here where we define the styles, or we can of course reach out to the style property, variable I should say, as we do, and we could adjust this style variable dynamically therefore. Basically here, this state show persons. If this is true, this means persons can be seen. So as I outlined in the last lecture, the button should then have a red background because a click will remove the persons. On the other hand, the default setup should be to not have a white background color, but a green one. And maybe we want to set the text color to white so that it does stand out with the normal color property. Now, if I save this, we have a green background color. If I click on it, we see the persons. Now that the persons are visible though, this should get a red background color. So what we can do is, in our if statement, which we already have, where we set the persons variable, We can of course do more. Besides setting this person's variable here, after doing that, I can also reach out to style and set the background color property, which the style object clearly has, we set it up here, to red of course, simply like that. So we simply get into this style object. We don't assign a new value, so it's still a constant, but we assign a new value to one of its properties, to the background color. And with this tiny change in place, we already got dynamic styling. Let me reload this application. Green button, red button, green button, and so on. So this shows one crucial thing which you really have to wrap your head around if you haven't already. Everything is JavaScript. I guess I said this before. We change the style dynamically just as we change this variable, persons, dynamically. Just as we change anything dynamically. We're talking about JavaScript here. You can manipulate the style object with any JavaScript code you want, and in the end, when you then bind it here, it will simply apply this, no matter how you edited it. This is a crucial takeaway, and this shows you how you can dynamically assign styles. Now, what about class names though? Can we also set these dynamically? Can we pass a list of class names? Yes, we can, and I will show you how it works in the next lecture. In the last lecture, you learned how to set styles dynamically. In the end, you learned you simply use JavaScript to manipulate whatever you then bind to the style property. Now, class name, of course, also can be set dynamically, like here for the app. But we can also introduce a new class to have something to play around. So we could, for example, say that we want to change something in our code here. Let's say this paragraph here, this is really working, depending on whether our list of persons has 3 elements, as it does have at the beginning, or less. So maybe we want to color the text red. So I will add a new class, which I'll name red, a normal CSS class, where I set the color red. And this will of course affect the text color. And maybe we even want to make it bold. So I'll name a class or create a class named bold, the name is up to you, if we are at 1 element left. So font weight bold. I got 2 new CSS classes. These are available globally, but right now I'm not using any. I now want to set the class name of this paragraph dynamically depending on the length of the elements in my persons array here. Below 2 or less elements, I should say, turn it red. 1 and less, red and bold. So to do that, I of course also need to adjust the classes or the class name I set to this paragraph dynamically. So what I'll do is I'll create a new variable here, which I'll name classes, and the name is totally up to you, where I in the end will create an array of strings. This is one way of doing that. Here I will add red and bold. And these are just the class names I defined here. Red and bold without the dot. Just the class name. I will then call join here and join them with an empty space. This will turn this array of strings into one string, which is in the end just red bold. This is what we'll get in the end. This is a valid CSS class list we can assign to class names. And of course I could have created this manually, but I will soon edit this array dynamically, which is why I want to have a generic solution. I can now go to this paragraph and add class name. And of course I don't have to bind this to a string as I do here. I can also bind this dynamically with single curly braces to the class's variable I have, which, keep in mind, is just a string joined with an empty space. If I now save this, and make sure you also saved the app CSS file, now let's go back to the application, and it's red and bold, right from the start without us touching any persons. That sounds a bit weird, but you know what I mean. So it's red right from the start because we always assign these classes. Now we can add some dynamic nature to that. We only want to do that if it's less than one person, otherwise it should be red if it's less than 2, or less than equal actually. And if we have all 3 persons, none of these classes should be attached. So let me actually do something else. I'll remove the join statement here and set classes to an empty array. And then I will simply add an if statement here. And if this state person's length is smaller or equal than 2, so only 2 or less persons left, I will take classes, this variable, and actually let is just the ES6 version of var, but we can use const here because I'm never assigning a new value. So if this is less than 2, I will call push, the normal JavaScript push method, to push the red class onto this array. So at this point of time, classes will be red, like this. I also will add another if check, where I will say if state person's length is smaller or equal than 1, and please note, this is no else if condition, it's just another if statement or if check coming after the first one because I want to run both. So if it's even smaller or equal than 1, then I will reach out to classes again and push another class, the bold class. So at this point of time, classes is red and it's also bold. Now, if we have only 2 elements in the persons array, we will just have red and we will skip this because this condition here will be false. Now we got an array of classes which might look like this, or be an empty array if we have all 3 elements. So I want to assign it here, and classes like this won't work anymore because now it's an array. We need to pass a string here though. Well, I can simply call join with an empty space in between, so a white space character on classes here when I assign it. I could of course also do this prior to this and store it in a new variable. With that, I'm now assigning a string, which is simply my joined array, either nothing, either just red, or red and bold with a white space in between. And now with that, let me save this and go back. If it now reloads, it's a black text by default. Now let's toggle the persons and let's remove one. Now it's red, but not bold. If I remove another one, now it's also bold. And now if I remove a third one, it stays like this, obviously. This is showing how you can also dynamically edit and assign classes. And I can't emphasize it enough. Everything is just JavaScript. So you work with your array of classes here as you do with a normal array, because it is a normal array in normal JavaScript. And all you do in the end here is you have to make sure that you actually assign a string, as we do here with the join method. And of course, you could have whatever logic you need to construct an array of classes or get a string with CSS classes by other means without joining an array. Whatever you have, maybe take some user input, which is a string by default. You can assign anything which is a valid string to class name, and it will then be handled as a list of CSS classes, which hopefully meet the classes you set up in your CSS file. So with that, you learned how to dynamically assign styles and edit them, and dynamically assign and edit classes. So now that you learned how to dynamically set styles and classes, let's go back to the limitations of inline styles you learned about. Most important for us right now, the fact that we can't assign a hover style for our button. Hover, which in CSS you would simply create with :hover, is a pseudo selector, which means it's a selector based on some other selector indicated by that colon. Now, we can't assign this in our current application. There, we got our style JavaScript object where we assign or create some styles for the button. But hover, how would we set it up here, right? Hover is not a CSS property. So we could fix this, of course, by styling the button in the CSS file, but I already mentioned that this style would then not be scoped to this component only, and all the buttons in our application would get the styling. Yes, we could work around this with some unique CSS IDs or classes, but having the possibility of using these inline styles here can also be pretty cool, Because, as we already do, you can edit them in your code because everything is JavaScript. So it would be nice if we could actually use pseudo selectors and media queries in our normal JavaScript inline styles. And by default, that's of course not possible. But we can add a third-party package, which is pretty popular, to add this functionality to our application. So let's do just that. For that, we need to install a new package. And here I opened my normal terminal on my Mac, or on Windows it would be the command prompt. This is just a terminal integrated into Microsoft Visual Studio Code. You can also open it over the options, View, Integrated Terminal. Now, this is the same terminal you have on your machine if you access it normally, but automatically navigated into your project folder. And there I will now install a package with npm install. I'll add --save to also save an entry in package.json so that we also fix the version number and can easily share our project. And then the package is called Radium. Simply hit enter now, and this will download and add this package to the project so that we can start using it. Radium is a popular package for React, which allows us to use inline styles with pseudo selectors and media queries. So pretty awesome. Now that it is installed, we can close the terminal again and we can start using it. Now to start using it, we first of all have to import it in the file where we want to use it. And this could be any of your files, could be the app.js file, could be the person file too, of course. Let's work in the app.js file though, because there is the button where I want to add a hover state. To be able to do this, I first of all need to import Radium. So I'll add an import statement here. Position doesn't matter, but it should be at the top of the file. I'll import Radium from Radium. This is the syntax you can use. Now with that imported, you can scroll all the way down where you export your app, and there you can call Radium as a function and wrap your app with it. Now this is called a higher order component, something we will also create in our course project later. It might look super fancy, but in the end it's just a component wrapping your component, adding, kind of injecting some extra functionality. In this case, some extra syntax, which will parse your styles and understand some extra features you can now start using. You can use this on both components created with class and extends component, as well as functional components. So there, if we add Radium, by importing Radium from Radium, we can also export Radium person here. Both works. Now with that added, we can start adding or using some new features. And we of course do this in our style, because Radium is all about styles. Here our style, which will get assigned to the button in the end. I want to add a hover style. And with Radium added and wrapping your export, you can simply add a new property, quotation mark, colon, hover, or any other pseudo selector. All pseudo selectors are supported. You need to wrap them in quotation marks though, because since they start with a colon, they are not valid JavaScript property names. As strings, they are though. As you know, you can create JavaScript properties as strings, or if you don't have an invalid character in them, just as we did before, like all these other properties. Now, the value simply is your set of styles for the hover state. So another JavaScript object where I will now set the background color to light green for the green button and the color of the text to black maybe. And I will also, of course, override hover down there where I override my background color. There, I will simply set style and now not dot hover because it's a string. We need to use squared brackets. So here we then assign a new value, a new JavaScript object where we use light red and black text, like this. With this, we're using a Radium feature, being able to assign a property which is a valid CSS pseudo selector and taking advantage of Radium to still have it work. Now, if you save this and all the other files and you reload your application, if you hover over the button, you see the change styling. Also, for the red button, though there it's not overwriting it to light red. So let's try a different color. Salmon does work, so light red didn't exist. But if I change it to salmon, now it works too. So this is pretty cool because now you have the best of both worlds. You have the normal CSS pseudo selectors you can add, and you still have scoped styles which you can easily edit from within your JavaScript code, as you can see here. Now, Radium doesn't limit you to using pseudo selectors as we did. You can also add media queries. Let's maybe do this in the person component, and let's do it in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we added Radium and started using it to change our button and add a pseudo selector, the hover pseudo selector. Now that's of course nice, but we can also use Radium to use media queries. Now, I'll do this in the person component. There we have a person class, and we could of course easily add a media query here where we say if the min width is, let's say, 500 pixels, then we override our person class to have a width of 450 pixels and no longer use percentages. We could absolutely do that, but I will comment this solution out because I don't want to use my CSS class. I want to show you how to do it with Radium, which you might need in some occasions if you want to scope it to a component or if you want to change it dynamically. So for that, I'll add a new style. And of course, you can name this constant whatever you want in my function here. And there, I now again will use a special selector, which will look really strange, but which works thanks to Radium. And don't forget to wrap your export with Radium down there, otherwise it won't work. And now you can write your media query here. Media, min length, min width, 500 pixels. And then define the styles as a JavaScript object. This still is a JavaScript property name, and I know this looks super weird, but since it's a string, it's a valid name. And Radium will parse it and of course understand it because it's a media query, and amongst pseudo selectors, it is something Radium understands. Now here, we could say that we want to set the width of the element to which we apply the style to 450 pixels. So a fixed width, which is not growing dynamically. And now I want to assign this to my component here, want to assign the style, and I do have my class added, but I now also have my style, which will override my class setting by default CSS rules, not because of Radium. And now we should see the following. If I reload the application, I toggle the persons. Now, as you can see, we now get an error that a plugin requiring add CSS, for example, when using keyframes, or, for us important, media queries, we need to wrap our application in a style root component. This is a component made available by Radium, and whilst wrapping the export with Radium is enough for pseudo selectors, for basically transforming selectors like media queries or also animations with keyframes, we need to wrap the entire application in a special component provided by Radium. There we can simply import style root from Radium. With this first Radium import here, we're importing the default export of that file, and then we import a named export, style root. And now we can simply wrap our whole application with that. So what we can do is we can simply go here, whoops, not in person, sorry, in the return statement, and simply wrap everything, the whole div with the class name app, into style root like this. Now if we save this and we reload the application, I click this again, now it works without an error. And if I resize this, you see the boxes are only staying in the middle, but they're not growing in width anymore. They are growing in width to 60% of the size though, if I go below my media query threshold, which was 500 pixels. So there, if I go below that threshold, it will basically stick to 60%. If I go above it, it will stay at the fixed width of 450 pixels. Important, wrap your entire application in the root component, only there, with the style root component provided by Radium, so that you can safely access advanced features, to call it like this, like media queries. For pseudo selectors alone, you don't need to do that. Whichever feature you use, you have to wrap a component where you plan on using Radium features like media queries, like pseudo selectors. You have to wrap the export with the Radium function, basically, which you import from the Radium package. So using Radium, one way of getting the best of both worlds, scoped styles and advanced CSS features like pseudo selectors and media queries. Over the last lectures, you learned about Radium, one third-party package which is very popular, which allows you to use inline styles with features like media queries. Now that's one way of scoping your styles, being able to easily edit them, and still use features like media queries. It's not the only way though. Wouldn't it be great if a CSS file like the person.css could be scoped to the person.js component file, so that whichever styles we define in here could be imported and assigned to elements in this component and wouldn't override styles in other components or other parts of the app, even if we were to share the names of the CSS classes. This is actually possible, and it's actually possible in the setup we use here. We can use a feature named Css Modules, and here I want to show you how to use that. First of all, I'll get rid of Radium. You can still find the old code for download attached to this module though. I'll get rid of this style setup here and no longer assign it here and no longer wrap my person export with Radium. I will also go to the app.js file, remove my Radium imports there, remove my style root wrapper I have here around my entire application, remove the wrapper of my export down there to basically remove all traces of Radium. And now I also need to remove the part where I override hover or where I set it, because that will no longer work without Radium. So we're back to the world we were in before we added Radium. Now I want to handle everything through scoped CSS files. And to do that, we actually need to tweak the build configuration of our project. Now, I mentioned earlier in the course that we're using these React scripts, that this is a package which exposes this whole build workflow to us. And we can't really edit the configuration. We could dig into the node modules folder, search for this package and edit it there, but this is something you should never do, because every time you rerun npm install, your changes will be overwritten. Thankfully, there is a command which gives us access to the configuration though, eject. You can run npm run eject to basically convert your everything is managed for me project into everything is managed for me, but I can edit the configuration project. Now, there won't be a way back, but it shouldn't break. It will still work in the same way it did before, but you can then edit the configuration. Of course, this should be done with care because you don't want to break the setup. Now, we will do it together here to unlock the feature of CSS modules. One important note, if you're using Git to track your changes, make sure you add and commit all changes before you run the eject command. It will not work otherwise. With that, you should open the terminal. Again, this is the one integrated into the IDE. And then you can run npm run eject here to eject the configuration. Now we're getting asked if we want to do that because we can't go back. I'll type Y. And we're done. And now all of a sudden we see new folders. The scripts folder and the config folder. Now, the scripts folder has one script for each command we had in the package.json file. You also see that our list of dependencies grew by quite a lot, because now we see all these development dependencies which are used under the hood. Babel, for example, is responsible for compiling ES6 to ES5. No worries, we won't dive deeply into that configuration. We won't tweak it, it will still work. However, for us interesting in the config folder is the webpack config.dev and webpack config.prod file. Webpack is basically the build, the bundling tool which gets used, which applies all kinds of transformations and optimizations on our files and bundles them together. And as part of this process, it also takes care about our CSS files. Remember that I said that it's Webpack which is able to parse this CSS import in our JavaScript file. Well, since Webpack is the one responsible for this, Webpack is the place where we can now also adjust the way we handle CSS files and where we can unlock this extra feature I was referring to using Css Modules. For that, in the webpack config.dev file, we should scroll down to module and then down to the module where you can spot the CSS extension here, where you test for CSS files. There we then use the Css Loader, and we don't need to edit that, and we shouldn't edit this, but we will tweak the options here for the Css Loader. There, I will set modules to true. Css Loader is a tool which simply parses and converts our CSS, extracts it and stores it, and it supports Css Modules, a feature I will show you how to use in a second. This is one part, setting modules to true. You also need to add local ident name with a capital I and capital N. And now you should add the following string here, which might look cryptic, but which in the end is important for your styles, your CSS classes getting unique names per component so that they don't override each other application-wide. Here you should use squared brackets, name. This will basically be your CSS class name. __ local. This will allow CSS Loader to assign it to a local component, to scope it basically. And then __, more squared brackets, #base64.5. This will basically give it a unique hash to make sure you don't overwrite your styles across your application. Now with that, simply copy that setup here and go to the config prod folder, webpack config prod. There you should also search for the Css Loader, and you will see that it looks a bit different there. And definitely don't overwrite minimize and source map. But since I copied everything from the other file, I will overwrite import loaders because that was part of the other configuration, and basically add modules true and my local ident name. So that we use CSS modules for both our development workflow and of course the production workflow, because we don't want to lose that feature when we ship the code on a real server. With that, make sure both config files are saved and feel free to close them. That's everything we need to edit. And be careful about editing anything else, you might break your setup here. With that, one important thing changed. When we import app CSS, it will now actually scope the CSS classes in this CSS file to this component where we imported, to app.js in this example. So here, if we have the classes app, red and bold, we can now import them from our CSS file. We also need to tweak that import statement therefore. All import classes from app CSS, this name is up to you. You could name it styles, whatever you want. I'll pick classes because it will be a object, a JavaScript object containing these CSS classes as properties. Sounds like magic? It kind of is, but it is magic done by the Css Loader, which allows us, or which basically transforms the CSS code in our CSS file to an object we can use in the JavaScript file. So now we got this classes property. This allows us to now go down to the place where we use a class, like here, class name, and no longer assign a string here, but reach out to that classes object we're importing, and there, app, for example, simply a property named app. This will refer to this class and apply it and its styles to this div. So just what it did before, but now using a totally different technique behind the scenes. Now, the CSS Loader, of course, doesn't do any real magic here. Instead, what's happening here is that the CSS Loader transforms the CSS class name we set up in the CSS file into a unique one, using this local ident name pattern we set up in the webpack config file, where it essentially takes the class name we defined, the file name of the JavaScript file where you import the class, and some random hash to generate a unique CSS class name. And then it simply stores all these unique class names it generated in this JavaScript object you import. And it stores them in the properties where the property names are your original CSS class names. So the values of these properties, like here for classes app, are simply the unique class names generated by CSS Loader. This is how this works behind the scenes. Of course, we also need to adjust our classes down there where we join our strings. This join syntax can stay there, but we no longer push strings. We simply push classes red and their classes bold, referring to the CSS classes not as strings but as properties on this classes object, which again we're importing from app.css. We can use this import statement because of the fact that we unlocked CSS modules. Now we got a name issue here because I have a constant named classes here. So I will name this to assigned classes and replace all the usages here with that, also down there where I use it. So that this classes property here really only refers to the classes we're importing. The same here and here. Let's save this and let's see if it still works. If we reload the application, it doesn't seem to work. If we inspect our application here on the div, we're not seeing this class. The reason for this is that we never restarted our development server. But if we change the configuration as we did, we have to do that. So in the terminal window where this is running, we have to quit the running process and simply restart npm start. Just as before, this should work, but now it will take this new configuration into account and reload this page once it is done restarting. Now we get an error here. Because I made an error in the configuration, should be base 64. I guess I said it, but I mistyped. Base 64, not 65. And also in the prod configuration. Save both configs and go back to that terminal where you run npm start. Quit the process and restart because we changed the setup again. And now let's reload this one more time with that error fixed. Now you see the old styles are getting applied. We see all the styles from before, including the update here for the paragraph, but the styles for the persons are lost. They are no longer looking like cards. Now that's normal because we haven't adjusted that component yet. Important for us, this style here is working, which we assigned to the whole div, and you see that strange name. That basically is a unique name because it's still CSS running in the browser, but by having this automatically generated unique name, only this div has this class, and even if we were to reuse this app CSS class anywhere else in the app, we wouldn't get the same styling because it's scoped to the component where we import it. So this is all working, and you see it also works for the red and bold class, which we push to the array, but now by accessing it as properties. The person is broken, because there we still import person like this, and this clearly doesn't work anymore. We need to import classes from person there too, or any other name you like, and now assign it as such. So not person as a string, but there simply classes.person, using the CSS setup you have here as a name of the property. And with that, now you see we're back to the old setup with our card look. Now finally, let's make that media query and that hover state work too with CSS modules. We'll do this in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we enabled CSS module by ejecting the configuration, fine-tuning it, and then importing classes from these CSS files and using them. Now let's also add pseudo selectors and media queries. Pseudo selectors are important here in the app.js file, where we assign a button style. Now we'll no longer do this inline, so I'll remove the style property on the button here. And I will no longer set the style background color to red here, and no longer set the style up like this. We could do this, but now I want to do it the CSS module style. So there, we could now create a button CSS class, which we then assign to the button, or we simply create a normal CSS rule. For every button nested inside our app class, we can now assign the styles we want. Now this should be the styles we had before. I deleted them, so I will simply try to rebuild it. We had a blue border, I guess. Let's add some padding, maybe 16 pixels. Let's add a background color of green by default maybe. And let's set the font into inherit. And now if we save this already, we should get this button style here, because we still apply our styles here, no longer inline though. Make sure to also save app.js to really see the changes. We should get this style now. No longer inline, but the button here is styled because it's nested below our app selector here. And app is this special selector applied to the outer div. Now let me simply tweak the color. And of course we still want to be able to set the button to red, and we want to be able to see us hovering over it. So let me add button hover, normal CSS code here, nothing fancy, and set the background color here to light green and the color to black maybe. And now let's add the red case. Now for that, I'll simply add app button red. So normal CSS rule to style any button which has the red class. Set the background color here to red. And now also add app button red hover to set the background color to salmon and the color to black for hovered buttons with the red class. Now all we need to do is conditionally add the red class to this button if we need it. So back in app.js, we simply need to bind the class name of the button. So we will do this in the render function, of course. Prior to the if statement, we have a default button class, which is null, let's say, or simply an empty string. Then inside this if statement, where I assign persons, I set button class equal to classes red. Let's see if that works. If I now go down to the button and add class name and set this equal to button class. Now, one important note, button class always needs to be a string if we assign it to class name. And classes red in the end is just a string created by the Css Loader, which gives us still access to the class like this, but in the end returns a string with the valid CSS. Or it is an empty string if we're outside of this if condition. Now let's save this. Let's reload the app. Hovering over it works. Well, we should add that cursor pointer thing. And clicking on it also works with that red class, which you can see is added now. So this also works for nested classes, as you can see. Red is a class we define only on buttons. And still, in our JavaScript component, we import it on that overall classes object. So any CSS class we define in the CSS file we import with that Css Modules enabled, any classes defined in here, even if they only apply to a special subselector, are available on the classes object we're importing from that CSS file. Now let me conclude this button thing here by now again adding a cursor, which is a pointer. With that, save all the files, and now we get this nice pointer here, everything working as it should. Let's next have a look at media queries. We learned how to use pseudo selectors and how we may even nest classes and still import them on that class's object here in the previous lecture. Now I want to take care about media queries, and that was something I wanted to do in my person class. There I assign the person CSS class to the outer div, and I actually already added the code earlier. I will simply comment it in. It's a normal CSS media query, adjusting our person class with this width if we have a viewport being broader than 500 pixels. I can save this adjusted CSS file, and it will still import this person class fine on this class's object here, even if it's wrapped inside a media query. So what we should see is that if I reload the application and I toggle my persons here, if I increase the viewport, the width of the boxes doesn't change. It only changes if it's small enough. There it will be 60% of the width. So that was super simple, and whilst it can be kind of challenging to wrap your hand around CSS module, simply think about this classes object here as a JavaScript object which gives you access to a string version of your CSS styles, of your CSS class, but of a CSS class which was adjusted to be unique. So it will simply just translate your person class to something like person underscore some unique hash, so that you can be safe and sure that when you use that class in a given component, that's the only place where the CSS styles apply. Nowhere else in your application can these styles have an effect. That's the idea behind CSS modules.